Have you ever imagined a civilization capable of transforming entire mountains into temples, cities, and fortresses, using nothing but stone, hammers, and time? Some of these structures emerged centuries before Christ, demonstrating the resilience of a primitive yet incredibly enduring form of engineering. There is something deeply strange about these places, because they were not built in the way we understand construction today. In today's video, we're going to show you 7 fortresses that were incredibly carved directly into rock formations. And honestly, the last one is by far the most astonishing of them all. Ellora Caves. The first time I heard about the Ellora Caves, I assumed there had to be some inevitable exaggeration in the descriptions. That always happens when a place survives for centuries, surrounded by legends. People say entire mountains were excavated using only hammers, chisels, and a level of religious devotion that is almost impossible to comprehend today. But once I began studying this place, I realized its scale goes far beyond any photograph. Ellora was not built stone by stone. It was removed from the mountain itself. Every corridor, every column, every temple, and every sculpture emerged through the opposite process of traditional architecture. Instead of raising structures, artisans removed tons of volcanic rock until they revealed a monumental complex that has remained intact for more than 1,000 years. And there is something profoundly unsettling about that, because looking at Ellora means looking at emptiness transformed into civilization. The caves are located in the Indian state of Maharashtra, near the ancient city of Aurangabad. The complex contains 34 main caves spread across approximately 1.2 miles of basalt cliffs. What makes the site even more remarkable is that it does not belong to a single religion. Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains shared that space over the centuries. In almost every other period of human history, religious conflicts usually ended in destruction. In Ellora, they ended in sculpture. Between the 6th and 10th centuries, different Indian dynasties financed monumental works along those dark volcanic walls. The result still appears impossible today. Not only because of the scale of the constructions, but also because of the absurd precision of details carved directly into solid stone. Every sculpted ceiling still carries marks from ancient tools that can still be seen today. There is also a political dimension behind Ellora. Indian rulers used monumental architecture as a demonstration of spiritual authority and territorial power. Financing gigantic temples guaranteed religious prestige and reinforced control over entire populations. But in the case of Ellora, there seems to be something beyond imperial propaganda. The scale of the project suggests an almost metaphysical ambition. It was not enough to build temples. They wanted to transform nature itself into a religious symbol. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. We post new videos every week, and that way you'll always be notified whenever a new video is released. Lalibela. In the mountains of Ethiopia, there is a city where entire churches were carved directly into the earth. Nothing there seems to follow the conventional logic of architecture. Lalibela emerged during the 12th century, in a turbulent period of the ancient Ethiopian kingdom. The ruler responsible for the project was King Gebre Meskel Lalibela, a figure surrounded by almost mythical stories within Ethiopian Christian tradition. According to local records, he wanted to create a new Jerusalem after the original holy city fell under Islamic control. The idea seemed impossible from the very beginning. When I observed the structures of Lalibela, I noticed something rarely seen in other ancient works. The entire terrain became part of the design. The churches were not raised above the ground. First, workers cut enormous rectangular blocks into the volcanic rock. Then they began excavating the interiors of those blocks until complete temples hidden beneath the surface were revealed. This method created a deeply unsettling landscape. From a distance, many of the structures almost disappear completely. Only when you get closer do deep corridors, narrow passageways, and sunken courtyards begin to emerge, leading towards monumental churches. There is a claustrophobic sensation in that place. The stone seems to swallow everything around it, including the sound of visitors. Among all the structures, the most famous is the Church of St. George, known as Beta Georgis. Whenever I see aerial images of it, I always have the same impression. It looks like a symbol intentionally buried into the planet. The church has the shape of a cross and was carved directly from a single block of rock. Its roof aligns with ground level, while the rest of the structure descends several yards beneath the earth. The geometric precision remains astonishing even today. The vertical walls appear to have been cut by modern machinery, even though they were produced using extremely simple tools. And there is one detail that especially captures my attention. The builders were not thinking only about the external appearance. Underground tunnels connect several churches, forming something close to a ceremonial labyrinth. Walking through those corridors must create a strange sensation of temporal displacement. In some sections, the light disappears completely, leaving only the damp smell of ancient stone behind. Vardzia. On the arid slopes of southern Georgia lies a place that feels as though it was pulled directly from a medieval hallucination. Vardzia appears carved into the walls of a massive cliff above the Kura River, hidden among silent mountains and freezing winds. The origins of Vardzia date back to the 12th century, during the height of the Kingdom of Georgia. The project began under the reign of King George III and was expanded by his daughter, the legendary Queen Tamar, one of the most revered figures in Georgian history. During that era, the kingdom faced constant threats from Mongol invasions and attacks by neighboring peoples. Building traditional fortresses was no longer enough. Something almost invisible to enemies had to be created. That is how the idea of transforming an entire mountain into a military refuge and spiritual center was born. Vardzia did not function solely as a monastery. It was also a defensive city, capable of sheltering thousands of people during wartime. At its peak, the complex contained hundreds of chambers connected by internal tunnels distributed across multiple levels of the cliffside. Some areas stored food, while others served as dormitories, wine cellars, libraries, and religious spaces. What impresses me most about Vardzia is the way the site blends into the surrounding environment. Unlike castles built to dominate the landscape, Vardzia seems to disappear into it. The entrances were discreet, many corridors remained hidden, and certain passageways could only be accessed through extremely narrow paths. For anyone observing from a distance centuries ago, that mountain would hardly appear capable of hiding an entire city within it. The builders took advantage of a relatively soft rock formation composed of volcanic tuff, which allowed deep excavations without requiring advanced technology. Even so, the engineering necessary to create multiple levels inside the cliff remains astonishing. There were ventilation systems, water channels, and structures designed to withstand long periods of isolation. All of this was achieved during an era marked by constant conflict and severe technical limitations. At the spiritual center of Vardzia stands the Church of the Dormition, considered the symbolic heart of the complex. Its interior preserves medieval frescoes that are extremely important to the history of Georgian art. Among them is a depiction of Queen Tamar that has survived almost completely intact through the centuries. I always find it fascinating when ancient faces outlive entire kingdoms. That silent painting continues observing visitors nearly 900 years later. Before we continue, answer me this question. Would you like to visit places like these, or have you already visited somewhere similar? Ajanta Caves. In the Indian state of Maharashtra, you can discover a group of caves that reflects the memory of a vanished empire. Whenever I look at Ajanta, I feel as though I am standing before a place that challenges the very logic of time itself. Monks, sculptors, and artisans spent centuries excavating the walls of a canyon until the mountain was transformed into a silent world of temples, dormitories, and ceremonial halls. The result does not resemble ordinary ruins. Ajanta gives the impression that the rock itself is still alive. The Ajanta Caves were carved into a curved cliff above the Wagora River. The valley forms a natural horseshoe shape, giving the site an atmosphere completely isolated from the outside world. For much of the day, the only dominant sound is the water flowing below the rock formations. Perhaps that was exactly what attracted the first Buddhist monks. They sought distance from crowded cities, absolute silence, and an environment suitable for deep meditation. The geography itself helped create a sense of spiritual separation. The earliest excavations began around the 2nd century before Christ, during the Satavahana dynasty. At that time, Ajanta was still relatively simple. The spaces mainly served as monasteries and places of worship for traveling Buddhist communities. The earliest chambers followed austere, almost minimalist lines. Discrete columns, dark corridors, and halls without excessive ornamentation. The primary goal was to create spaces for contemplation rather than monumental displays. Even so, the precision of the stone cutting was already remarkable. Centuries later, between the 5th and 6th centuries, a second phase completely transformed the complex. Under the influence of the Vakataka dynasty, Ajanta underwent a massive expansion. This period produced the site's most famous murals, monumental sculptures, and elaborate facades. The place was no longer merely a monastic retreat. It became a sophisticated artistic center funded by nobles, wealthy merchants, and local authorities. It is fascinating to realize how spirituality and political power so often walk side by side throughout human history. The murals of Ajanta hold extraordinary importance in the history of world art. Many paintings survived for more than 1,000 years in an environment vulnerable to humidity, candle smoke, and natural erosion. When I observe those images, I am amazed by the emotional sophistication visible in the faces portrayed. They are not stiff or overly symbolic figures. There is sadness, serenity, doubt, and compassion reflected in the eyes painted by the artists. In certain sections, the characters almost seem to stare directly at whoever enters the cave. Cappadocia. A region in central Turkey where the landscape feels like the result of a geological hallucination. Stone pillars rise from the ground like petrified spears. Mountains contain windows manually carved thousands of years ago, and entire cities remain hidden beneath the surface. Wind shaped part of this scenery, but human hands transformed those volcanic formations into complex refuges. Every tunnel excavated there reveals an ancient relationship between survival and isolation. It was not merely an architectural choice. It was a necessity imposed by the constant violence of history. In Cappadocia, the rock became shelter, hiding place, and fortress all at once. The origin of that landscape began millions of years before human presence. Volcanic eruptions covered the region with enormous layers of compacted ash, creating a rock known as volcanic tuff. Unlike granite or hard basalt, found in other regions of the world, this material could be carved relatively easily. Time then completed the work begun by the volcanoes. Rain, wind, and climate changes slowly eroded the terrain, until formations now known as fairy chimneys emerged. Some resemble gigantic mushrooms. Others look like natural towers from a lost civilization. Whenever I see images of these pillars, I think very few regions on Earth possess such an instantly recognizable visual identity as Cappadocia. Nature itself had already prepared the scenery long before the first inhabitants arrived. The earliest peoples began occupying the area as far back as the Bronze Age. The Hittites, one of the great powers of ancient Anatolia, quickly recognized the defensive potential of that irregular terrain. Instead of constructing traditional walls, many communities began using the mountains themselves as natural protection. Corridors were discreetly excavated. Small chambers appeared inside the hills. Entrances could easily be hidden among the rock formations. This created a defense system that was extremely difficult for outside invaders to detect. The geography of Cappadocia favored ambushes, rapid disappearances, and secret movement. In an era marked by constant warfare, possessing an underground refuge dramatically increased the chances of survival. Over the centuries, the region was ruled by Persians, Macedonians, Romans, and Byzantines. Each civilization left its own marks across the territory. The name Cappadocia most likely comes from a Persian term associated with horse breeding, since the region became famous for its resilient and fast animals. Even so, what impresses me most is not the military power of these cultures, but the way they learned to live inside the stone itself. Houses, barns, storage rooms, and temples became part of the mountain. There was no clear separation between construction and nature. The landscape was adapted directly into everyday human life. Longmen Grottoes. South of the ancient imperial capital of Luoyang, silence seems to possess its own weight. The Longmen Grottoes do not leave an impression solely because of their size. What truly stands out is the feeling of historical continuity carved into the cliffs. Every opening sculpted into the limestone appears to preserve fragments of an entire civilization. Over centuries, monks, artisans, and rulers transformed those rock walls into one of the greatest centers of Buddhist art ever created in Asia. Whenever I observe that landscape, I feel as though the mountain stopped being part of nature and became a human archive instead. The complex began taking shape during the late 5th century, under the rule of the Northern Wei dynasty. The imperial court had transferred its capital to Luoyang and sought to strengthen political influence through the Buddhist religion. Massive spiritual projects also functioned as public demonstrations of authority. Carving gigantic images into mountains conveyed stability, wealth, and permanence. It was not only religious devotion. There was political strategy behind that monumental effort. The grander the project, the greater the impression of power imposed upon the population and rival territories. The chosen location carried both symbolic and strategic importance. The grottos were carved between two hills facing the Yi River. The constant flow of water created a contemplative atmosphere suited for Buddhist spiritual practices. At the same time, the valley functioned as an important route near the imperial capital. This guaranteed a continuous circulation of travelers, monks, and members of the elite. Longmen was not isolated from the world. It was directly connected to the political heart of medieval China. Everything there was designed to reinforce cultural prestige and religious influence. The earliest works displayed strong artistic influences from Central Asia and Indian Buddhist traditions. This can be seen in the more rigid features of the ancient figures, the stylized garments, and the elongated proportions of certain sculptures. Over time, Chinese artists began adapting those foreign models into their own cultural identity. Faces became softer, gestures more natural, and expressions started conveying refined calmness. Observing Longmen is like witnessing the gradual transformation of Buddhist art within Chinese territory. The stone records cultural change as though it were a living document. The number of sculptures throughout the complex exceeds 100,000 representations. Some are tiny images, almost hidden inside discrete niches. Others dominate entire walls, standing several yards tall. This contrast creates a very unusual visual sensation. Petra. This is the final and most incredible place on our list, a city hidden among the reddish canyons of Jordan. that seems to have been designed to remain invisible to the rest of the world. When I think about Petra, I do not imagine ancient ruins alone. I imagine an entire civilization learning to master stone, trade, and geographic isolation simultaneously. The surrounding mountains functioned as nearly impenetrable natural barriers. For centuries, travelers crossed immense deserts without suspecting that a sophisticated metropolis was hidden behind those narrow rock walls. Petra was never meant to be easily discovered. Its strength depended precisely on that. Long before the arrival of the Romans, the region was controlled by the Nabateans, an Arab people extraordinarily skilled in commerce and desert survival. They began consolidating Petra around the 4th century before Christ. The site occupied a strategic position between trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean. Caravans carrying spices, silk, perfumes, and incense constantly crossed that territory. The Nabateans quickly realized that controlling water and passage routes meant controlling wealth. Petra expanded according to that economic logic. The main entrance to the city passes through the Esaiku, a narrow corridor surrounded by gigantic stone walls. In certain sections, the passage is only a few yards wide. Walking through it creates a strange feeling of confinement. The walls partially block the sunlight and create curves that prevent any broad view of the path ahead. This was not merely an interesting natural feature. It also functioned as an efficient defense against invaders. Large armies would have faced enormous difficulty crossing that corridor while under attack from the upper sections of the canyon. At the end of the Sikh appears Petra's most famous image, Al-Khazne, popularly known as the Treasury. The monumental facade suddenly emerges between the canyon walls as though it had been placed there by some impossible scenery. Whenever I see that pink-colored structure illuminated by the desert sun, I struggle to accept that everything was carved directly into the rock. Columns, sculptures, niches, and decorative details were not constructed separately. Every element emerged from the mountain itself. That required an absurd level of planning. A single major mistake could permanently compromise the entire facade. Despite its popular nickname, Al-Khazne most likely did not function as a royal treasury. Many archaeologists believe the structure served a funerary or ceremonial purpose. The Nabateans left behind very few detailed written records, so part of Petra's history remains surrounded by interpretations and theories. I find it fascinating when ancient civilizations preserve gigantic monuments while leaving fundamental mysteries without definitive answers. It creates a feeling of historical distance that can never be completely erased.